Hello, welcome to lecture 25. The second part of my series on digestion and absorption and metabolism. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about what a calorie is and how we turn the nutrients that we've absorbed into energy for our bodies to do stuff. This is truly the biochemistry of food. So let's begin by just saying, what the heck is a calorie? Well, let's consider that for a moment. The answer to this question is a little bit different depending upon who you're talking to. Are you talking to a scientist or a nutritionist? Well, nutritionists are a type of scientists. But there's different ways to think about what a calorie is, and depending on the various perspectives. So we're going to take both Beaker and the Swedish chef's perspective into consideration here, the scientist and the nutritionist. So Beaker says, beep, 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 1 calorie equals 4.18 joules. 1 calorie equals 4.18 joules. All right, well, a joule is a unit of energy in not quite the metric system, but the System International. Okay, what does the chef say here? Well, he says 1 calorie equals 4,184 joules. All right, we are 3 orders of magnitude off in our understanding of each other. The big difference here is, let me point it out, that the calorie that the chef is talking about is a big C calorie. All right? And I'll explain the origin of this distinction between a small C calorie and a big C calorie. 1 big C calorie equals 1,000 small C calories, also equals 1 kilocalorie, or kcal. All right, we're going to see what all that means in just a moment here. But let's do some fun stuff first. Let's talk about history. Everybody loves history. The story of the calorie really begins with this guy, Santorio Santorio. First name, same as the last. Special guy. This gentleman was a pretty clever person living back in the 16th and 17th century, who measured literally everything he ate and excreted, and talked about it in his book, Statica Medicina. You can see in this picture here, he actually sat on a scale to eat his meals and measured exactly how much weight he consumed of his food, and then massed out how much urine and how much feces he excreted from his body, and realized that there was a discrepancy here. He was putting more mass into his body than was coming out of his body. What the heck was going on? But his body, he wasn't gaining any weight. There was something happening here. There was something happening, and he believed that the body was a little bit of a bonfire, that perhaps the food was burning inside. He invented the first clinical thermometer. He actually wanted to measure the heat that was generated inside the body to see if he could quantify this heat that his body was producing. Pretty clever individual. The first thermometer had a giant bulb glass bulb that you had to stick in your mouth that went down to a little reservoir of mercury. I can't imagine that was especially fun, but very clever individual. Let's jump forward a century and a half to our old friend Antoine Lavoisier. We've talked about him quite a bit. So he developed, Lavoisier and another guy named Laplace developed the ice calorimeter. So he noticed that the heat produced by an animal can be measured indirectly by assessing the amount of water that elutes from the bottom of chamber of ice. So he'd stick a mouse down in this super cold little chamber and then look at how much of the mouse's body heat was able to melt the ice. And there was an ice jacket around the inner ice sleeve that made it so that only the heat from the mouse was melting the ice. Pretty clever experiment. Maybe this is why the people cut his head off at the French Revolution. They were all animal rights activists that objected to this treatment of mice. Anyways, trying to get a little bit more quantitative about Santorio-Santorio's understanding of the heat produced by a body. You'll remember that Lavoisier was interested in combustion himself. He was the first person to burn a diamond in front of the Louvre. All right. Arguably the only person, I would imagine. So let's jump forward a little bit further. What is a calorie? We're still trying to figure it out. Well, it's a unit of thermal energy. 1 calorie, as I've said, is one big C calorie is 1,000 small c calories, which is 1 kilocalorie, which is 4.186 kilojoules. All of this is simply the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree C. So to remind you that 1 kilogram of water is 1 liter, which equals 1,000 cubic centimeters, which equals 1,000 milliliters. This definition, the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of a kilogram of water by a degree centigrade, was in a 1863 article in the journal Nutrition entitled History of the Calorie in Nutrition. This was the same month as the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, just as a point of reference. All right, so let's keep moving forward. This gentleman here, Wilbur Olin Atwater, brought this definition of the calorie from France to the United States in 1887. And there's a description of it published in a popular periodical at the time called Century Magazine. Calorie. The unit of energy commonly employed in these calculations is the amount of heat which would raise the blah, 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 1 degree, blah, 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 as we've already said. All right. One of the interesting things about him, however, was that he came up with remarkably accurate numbers for the potential energy in calories of the various nutrients in food. He recognized, nutritionists in general recognized at the time that there were the proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, which were the 3 macronutrients, and that proteins and carbohydrates both had about 4.1 calories per gram. For a gram of a protein or a gram of a pure carbohydrate, you're going to get about 4.1 calories, big C calories, of energy out. Whereas fats are a more energy-dense food. Actually, you get 9.3 calories, big C calories, out of a gram of fat. Important person. There's a podcast about him that talks about Atwater values and calorimetry. Very interesting. You should listen to that. But he noted that the mechanical efficiency of the best machine, the most efficient machine in terms of its energy, was about 8%, but that humans and animals had about a 20 to 30% efficiency. So this was explained the need to provide sufficient potential energy, chemical energy from food to support manual labor. All right, so let's put all of this into practical terms so that we can actually understand what we're talking about. What is a joule or a calorie? First, let's think about joules. So a joule in everyday life represents, here's just some examples. 1 joule is the heat required to raise the temperature of a gram of water by about 1/4 degree. It's also the energy that you burn lifting a tomato 100-gram tomato 1 meter, basically a yard, vertically from the surface of the earth. Every time you bend down to pick up a tomato, you're burning a joule of energy. It's also the energy released when that same tomato falls back down to earth. Splat. The typical energy released by a person at rest every 17 milliseconds. So just sitting there listening to me, every 1/60th of a second, you are burning a joule. Every second, you're burning 60 joules. It's the amount of electricity required to light a 1-watt LED light bulb, a small little LED for 1 second. Cool. Yeah. So 1 calorie, and we're talking about big C calories here. So this is 1,000 joules. This is the heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree C. Not 1,000 joules, 4,100 and whatever joules. The energy in 1 calorie is enough to lift a beach ball-sized boulder, 418 kilograms, 1 meter vertically from the surface of the earth. That's a big tomato. It's also the energy that gets released when that boulder falls back down to the ground. Don't drop it on your toe. The energy released by a person at rest every 60 seconds. So every 70 seconds. So every 1 minute and 10 seconds, you're burning 1 calorie. And it's also the energy that you need to light 1-watt LED light bulb for 70 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes. Cool. So now that we have a sense of what a calorie can do for you, 1 calorie can do for you, this is what you have to do to get 200 of these things. So, and this is really looking at the energy density of foods. On the left-hand side, we have a can of green beans. Say you open up some green peas and you want to eat 357 grams of those. That's 200 calories. You can also eat 40 grams of M&Ms, that little handful there. You can eat 4 pieces of flaxseed bread, or you can do a tiny little dose of canola oil, right? So we know that fats are more energy dense than carbohydrates, and we can see that in this example here, 90 grams of bread, only 23 grams of oil, same amount of calories. Kiwi fruit, you need 328 grams of that stuff versus only 73 grams of chips. Way to go, chips. Baby carrots, you have to eat quite a lot of that. That's a big plate of baby carrots, 570 grams of carrots, and that's going to be a pretty low glycemic index food, whereas fried bacon, you only need 30 grams. That's just a couple pieces to equal that whole plate of carrots. Even more broccoli compared to gummy bears. A small hand full of gummy bears, maybe like 15 a dozen there, something like that, is equal to 3 full bunches of broccoli. You have to eat many stalks of celery to equal a glass of Coca-Cola. On and on and on. Kind of interesting. You can eat a whole apple versus just a little wad of peanut butter. So much more energy dense because of all the fat in the peanut butter. Honeydew melon, half a melon is equal to a handful of salted mixed nuts. All right. So in terms of the macronutrients, what does America eat? And then what do you eat? This is something you can ask yourself. Most Americans eat, between men and women, they eat around a little over 60%, so 2/3 of their diet comes from some kind of carbs. That number is really elevated because of the fructose consumption in this country, and we're going to get to fructose, I promise you. And then the recommendations are 50% of your diet from carbs and the other 50% evenly split between proteins and fats. The typical American diet skews towards carbs right now. So, and a lot of that is due to added sugars. Being aware of your added sugar consumption can really bring your numbers back into a healthy balance if you eat a lot of added sugar. All right, so let's look at the bulk caloric needs and the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates of what those needs are by day, per day, by age, gender, and your level of activity. So we can see here that I have your age bracket. I have the age bracket of the typical college student in orange here. And we can see that active males and active females peak at around in their caloric needs at around the same age, at about age 17 or 18, right in there. However, one thing that is interesting to note is that women have a much broader growth peak than men. Women reach their max, typically reach their max caloric demand much earlier than men, and they sustain it for much longer than men. So the typical active woman at age 14 reaches her max caloric needs and is at that point until she is in her late 20s or 30 years old. Whereas for men, that peak really comes between the ages of 16 and 18. So a much more brief and intense peak for men, and a much broader and sustained growth peak for caloric need peak for active women. Calculating, so the idea of basal metabolic rate is simply the minimal amount of energy that your body is going to burn in a day totally at rest. All right, and it's been parameterized a number of times. This is the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation for men and women that was parameterized by some physiologists at the University of Nevada Med School. And then you can take your basal metabolic rate and multiply it by a factor which is determined by your level of activity to find out how many calories a person you should probably be consuming in a day to maintain your weight without having any weight loss or weight gain. So these levels of activity are anywhere from primarily sedentary. So your main activity is walking from the kitchen to the couch. You're not really that much above your basal metabolic rate. People who take a leisurely walk, do house chores, like to golf, they are a little higher. And everywhere, the range goes all the way up to people engaged in intense daily exercise or heavy manual labor, heavy lifting, endurance athletes, competitive team sport athletes who are doing that 6 to 7 days a week for 90-plus minute sessions, et cetera, et cetera. These people have roughly twice their basal metabolic rate in terms of their caloric needs in the day. So there's a pretty wide range in the caloric needs that an individual might need of given their level of activity. Okay, let's figure out what we're doing, how we're generating calories, what we're doing with this food that we consume. And to go there, I need to introduce the concepts of catabolism, anabolism, and what ATP is. So first, let's just talk about metabolism, the metabolism. Metabolism is simply the sum of all chemical processes that occur in an organism. So it's the net equation, that, so to speak, of everything you're building and breaking down. It's the whole ledger, and the whole energetic ledger for your body. Catabolism is the metabolic pathways that are going to break big things down into smaller ones. So catabolisms, catabolic processes, are going to produce energy for the body to do things with. All right? Catabolism breaks things down. Anabolism are the metabolic pathways that are going in the opposite direction. All right? You build things up from simpler molecules in anabolic processes. Anabolism requires energy. It takes energy to build a block tower, and it releases energy to knock it down. Way to remember all this is ABCD. Anabolism is building, catabolism is destroying, if that helps you. ABCD. Anabolism, breaking up or building up, like an anabolic steroid, for example, or catabolism, breaking down. Like a cataclysm. All right. The next idea here that you need is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So we get energy from the food we eat, but we store it as potential energy in this molecule called ATP. ATP is made up of 3 phosphate groups attached to a nucleoside called adenosine. Nucleosides are just the building blocks that we make nucleic acids out of, like DNA and RNA, and they're components in the vitamins FAD and NAD+, that we taught, the cofactors that we talked about a few lectures ago. So these are the nucleosides, and we attach phosphate to them, and we make adenosine triphosphate. It's these phosphodiester bonds here that contain the energy that we're going to tap, and that's where we're going to store them. So through the process of these linked phosphate groups. These linked phosphate groups in the backbone of ATP are pretty easy to break because the negative charge on one phosphate doesn't really want to be next to the negative charge on the adjacent phosphate. They repel each other. When we break one of these oxygen phosphorus bonds, a new bond is formed between a phosphorus and a hydroxyl group. We hydrolyze this. We're taking water and we're adding it across that bond. And we are releasing this energy that was stored in the oxygen, in that phosphodiester bond between the 2 phosphate groups in the backbone of the ATP. So we take an ATP, hydrolyze it with water, break it up with water, and it releases a phosphate group and ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups left. That plus some energy. And that energy is the difference in energy between ATP and ADP. All right. Energy. So hydrolyzing ATP into ADP releases about 7.3 kilocalories per mole. A mole is 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd molecules. A lot of these molecules need to get broken up to equal 7.3 kilocalories. Luckily, you've got a lot of them in you. So this process of going from ATP to the ADP and energy is called exothermic. Exo meaning outside, thermic heat. It's releasing heat. It's an exothermic reaction. It gives off heat. So when you burn ATP, like when you're jogging, this is one of the reasons you get warm. It is the reason that you get your body gets warm. You're releasing all that energy from breaking the ATP down. On the other hand, going from ADP and remaking ATP to burn again because you've just taken a meal or eaten a power bar or something after your jog, that process requires 7.3 kilocalories per mole. This is called endothermic. We're actually absorbing heat, absorbing energy from the breakdown of glucose to reform ADP with the inorganic phosphate into ATP. All right, endothermic and exothermic. Together, they form the ATP cycle. So we go from ATP, we break it down into ADP and release energy for anabolic processes for building things up, like muscle contractions or active transport or synthesis of larger proteins. And then we need energy from catabolic processes, breaking glucose down to reform ADP into ATP again for another round about this energy cycle. This is how we use, and we're going to talk about how we use food to generate this energy to drive the ATP cycle, which is which underlies everything that enables you to be a living creature. So we get energy from glucose, the basic monosaccharide, the simple sugar, the blood sugar. And our body has two ways to get energy from glucose. There is anaerobic or aerobic pathways. Anaerobic usage of glucose is what we call lactic acid fermentation. It's because we break glucose down into lactic acid. Breaking one glucose down into lactic acid, 2 molecules of lactic acid, gives us 2 molecules of ATP. So one glucose will give us 2 molecules of ATP. This doesn't require oxygen at all. And this is what any kind of intense anaerobic activity is going to give you. So for example, this weightlifter over here who just lifted this weight was probably doing anaerobic fermentation. All right? We also call it fermentation. On the other hand, our body has other mechanisms for breaking glucose down and burning it in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. And this is a much, did I say much enough times? Much more efficient way to utilize the chemical energy that's in glucose. For every glucose that you burn aerobically, we get 32. 16 times as much ATP. Much more efficient way to burn that energy. Maybe your goal here is to not be efficient necessarily. You certainly burn more glucose through lactic acid fermentation. But if your goal is to keep chugging for the long haul, get aerobically tuned, like this guy down here, marathon runner. All right, we're gonna revisit that in a bit, but I want to introduce the concept of the absorptive and post-absorptive states. The absorptive state is when you've eaten. Your GI tract is full. You're absorbing food. Anabolic processes exceed catabolic processes. Make hay when the sun shines. You're building things up because you're absorbing nutrients. The fuel for this is glucose. All right, so here it is. It's 8 a.m. in the morning. You have low blood sugar, low lipids in the blood, and low amino acids. You have breakfast. You pump it up. We are in the absorptive state from 8 a.m. till about noon when the circulating levels of glucose, fats, and proteins, sugar, fat, and protein drops down low enough that we enter the post-absorptive state. This is what happens when you've absorbed all the nutrients out of your GI tract, and catabolic processes begin to exceed anabolic processes. We're breaking things down more than we're building them up. When we are in this post-absorptive state, the fuel that we use for this is called glycogen, which is stored glucose, the animal starch that we've talked about, that we store in our muscles and in our liver. And then also fat can be the fuel that fuels the post-absorptive state. We're in there for a long enough period during the lunch hour, and then we finally have lunch, and we enter another absorptive state until we get to dinner time, another meal, a brief period of post-absorption. We have another meal, and we're good till about 10 o'clock, at which point we go to sleep and enter a prolonged post-absorptive state where our blood sugar is being maintained by the slow release of glucose from the glycogen that's stored in our liver, and a little bit of fat, perhaps. This is why, one of the reasons, you can look by looking at this chart, you can see why it's important to get on a regular sleep schedule, because if you stay up really late, and if you're awake during a significant portion of the post-absorptive state, you get hungry. This is why, for example, you go on a Thursday night binge and you are up quite late. You get the munchies past midnight. You want to eat again. And so then you really limit the amount of time that your body is in a post-absorptive state, which has some consequences in terms of glycogen clearance and lipid metabolism in the body. We'll get into a little bit of that later. But it shows that this is showing the importance of the coupling between your sleep cycle, your circadian sleep cycle, and your nutrient processing that happens in the body. All right. So getting towards the end of this one here, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of metabolism. This is, like, we've talked about what metabolism is. Here's a diagram that helps you see it. So remembering that catabolism is breaking things, big things down and releasing energy. Anabolism is building bigger things up from smaller things and making things happen using energy for motion, etc. All right, so there are the organic molecules that are circulating in our blood, amino acids, lipids, and the simple sugars, the macronutrients. Those get absorbed by a cell and enter the nutrient pool in the cytoplasm of a cell. And from there, they can either be anabolically constructed into bigger things, like used for the maintenance and repair of the cell, the growth of the cell. Maybe they have secretion of products that need, cell products that needs to happen. Or maybe some of the sugars can get put into stored reserves. The nutrient pool can also be drawn upon for catabolism. We can send those simple sugars into, we can start breaking them down and send the byproducts into the mitochondria for the production of ATP. It is that ATP that drives, the energy from that ATP drives anabolic processes. We use that energy to build things. We also use that ATP for motion, contraction, transport, blah, 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 all kinds of different things. All the stuff that a cell does that requires energy comes from the ATP. And about 60% of that energy that is released in catabolism in the mitochondria in our cells is actually lost as heat. This is why we get hot when we exercise. So let's look at metabolism during the absorptive state. This is when you've just finished eating, your GI tract is full. I've labeled the catabolic pathways in orange and the red and the anabolic pathways in blue. During the absorptive state, the anabolic pathways dominate. The anabolic pathways dominate. There's a lot of blood sugar around because we're absorbing it from the gut. Insulin is around, it got released by the pancreas. It allows us to take up the glucose in our blood. And that glucose is absorbed by the cells and broken down to release ATP into a molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate gets absorbed by the mitochondria and goes through oxidative or aerobic energy production, right? So that first part, the glycolysis, is anaerobic, and then that second part where the pyruvate, which is the breakdown product of glucose, goes into the mitochondria, that is aerobic. You can see that it's absorbing oxygen and producing all of that ATP, the 32 molecules of ATP that are coming off of a single glucose molecule. That ATP is going to be used to drive all of these catabolic processes. So we can take some of this molecule called acetyl-CoA, which is the carbon molecule that is a breakdown product of glucose through pyruvate. That acetyl-CoA can get built up into new fats. We call this de novo lipogenesis, but it's basically storing carbon, storing energy as fats, fatty acids, which then can get synthesized into triglycerides in combination with glycerol that comes off of glycolysis. We can also take pyruvate and use it to build new amino acids and then take those amino acids and build proteins out of them. So there's this level of structural storage and functional components, which is described by the proteins, the lipids. Glucose can also be stored as glycogen, right? So it's this idea of make hay while the sun shines. There's a lot of blood glucose. We're going to use the glucose to build things, build proteins, and then store energy in the form of glycogen and store energy in the form of fat if necessary. If there's a lot of excess acetyl-CoA coming out of the mitochondria, then we're going to store some of that as fat. This aerobic process gives off carbon dioxide, which we ultimately goes into our blood and we ultimately exhale as our breath. All right. On the other hand, there's the post-absorptive state. This is when you're asleep. So our blood glucose is, we're not absorbing any food, so we need to get our glucose from somewhere else. Well, we take it out of the bank. We take glycogen out of our glycogen stores and break it down into glucose, and then take that glucose and use it anaerobically to make pyruvate, and we also use the pyruvate, convert it into acetyl-CoA, and send it to the mitochondria to make more ATP. And that's where we're getting our energy. It's stored glucose in the form of glycogen that we're breaking down. We're also going to, if we really need energy and our glycogen is depleted, if there's not a lot of glycogen left in our liver or our muscle cells, then we can start to burn lipids, the triglycerides that are stored in our liver. And a number of hormones can govern this. So glucagon or epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, glucocorticoids or growth hormone, all of these hormones stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides into the fatty acids, which can then be used as the breakdown products as acetyl-CoA by mitochondria. Acetyl-CoA is really the linchpin molecule. We can make pyruvate if we're desperate, if there's no no glycogen, if there's no lipids left in the liver, we can begin to break down, if you're actually starving kind of, you can begin to break down proteins into amino acids, and those amino acids can be used to make pyruvate. And we can also go through the process of gluconeogenesis to make glucose out of the pyruvate to ship the glucose out of that cell into the bloodstream. So if there is not much glucose, if there's not much glycogen, if you've really burned all your glycogen and we're burning fats to get ATP, one of the byproducts, an active liver cell can produce so much acetyl-CoA from the breakdown of lipids that it gets converted into something called a ketone body. Ketone bodies can get released into the blood and are able to pass the blood-brain barrier and can be taken up by all the cells in your body. These ketone bodies, I have some examples on the right-hand side. Those ketone bodies can then get converted, picked up by cells, and converted back into acetyl-CoA to produce more energy by the cell. All right. Okay, I think that's everything. Kind of a complex slide, but important. All right, the next lecture is lecture 26, feeding our cells glucose. We're going to talk about how to get glucose into our cells to do all this metabolism that I've just told you about. I told you about a lot of metabolism there. Let's figure out how we get the glucose from the gut to the cells.